omnibus bills that have ever been introduced in Canadian history. And I find it interesting that it comes from Prime Minister Harper, because before Prime Minister Harper was Prime Minister, he was the biggest vocal critic against omnibus bills. And why was he against omnibus bills? And what omnibus bills are? It's a whole bunch of changes to a whole bunch of legislation. So say 100 bills all at once. It'll be like 500 pages long. Why was he against that? Because he said it was undemocratic and violated the rule of law in this country. He's quoted as saying that. So now he has the worst ones ever in history. So we have this scenario where not only was all of this legislation introduced, I haven't even talked about that yet, but at the same time he announced funding cuts to all of our political organizations to make sure that we wouldn't have a political voice to oppose the legislation. He thought we only existed in terms of funded political organizations. He made a gross miscalculation and forgot about the fact that actually we still have all of our grassroots people. And they might have thought it was easy dealing with chiefs one-on-one. But imagine trying to deal with a chief when he's got his whole nation behind him. That changes the playing field. And that's what we've shown them. Our leaders aren't alone anymore. So it started out, a lot of people, about Bill C-45. He might even have been the first protester, who knows. But Bill C-45 was one of those large omnibus bills which was going to unilaterally amend the Indian Act and unilaterally amend protections for the majority of lakes, rivers, and waterways in this country. And without any consultation with the Canadian public as well. So it wasn't just us that was protesting this. It was also First Nations people, and this is the primary reason why the treaty chiefs and other chiefs protested on Parliament. This crazy thing. Here's the legislation that we're talking about, and it's an awful lot of legislation. Now, there's other pieces of legislation that have since been introduced, and there's other pieces of legislation that indirectly impact Indigenous peoples. But all of these pieces of legislation, and sometimes you see them on our protest signs, all have wonderful names, like safe drinking water, like gender equity, like family homes on reserves, and self-government. What First Nation leader would dare oppose any of these bills? Because they sound really great. And if you do, especially if you oppose a bill like First Nations Financial Transparency Act, well, then the automatic assumption is going to be that you're one of those corrupt chiefs that make $1 million a year, and of course you're opposing that. And the government can really use that to drive a wedge with community members. But that's because the majority of people don't actually read the legislation to see what's in it. The First Nation Financial Transparency Act, and I'm just only going to use that one as an example, has nothing to do with making First Nations leaders accountable or financially transparent. What that bill does include is a provision that says First Nations leaders must submit audited financial statements every year. And they do that already. You don't get a cent as a First Nation leader in this country unless you submit your financial audited statements. In fact, if you don't do it in a timely way, you could be put into co-management. That means Indian Affairs starts controlling your business. And if you continue to refuse, you can be put into third party, which means Indian Affairs controls all of your business. So why would they put something like that in there if that's something that already has to be done? It sends a very strong message to community members and the public. Don't trust your leaders. See, we have to legislate this. The implication is that leaders are all corrupt. And that helps undermine our movements. It helps undermine anything that we want to do to advance forward. They don't have fact-based conversations around these pieces of legislation. If they did, we wouldn't even have a Financial Transparency Act. Because when they say we have to do something to stop these millionaire chiefs, what they don't tell you is there's never in the history of Canada been a millionaire chief paid from federal funding, ever. And I know I used to work there. I used to work at Justice Canada. It's all public information. Ever, there's never been a millionaire chief paid from Indian Affairs financial funding. Even they'll single out individual chiefs and say, these chiefs must be corrupt because this chief makes X amount of money. Well, if you look at all of the chiefs and band councillors across the country, it adds up to like 2,500 First Nation leaders. The average salary is $36,000. $36,000. The average Canadian salary is $46,000. Seems to me Canadians are living a very high on the hog, corrupt life in comparison to our leaders. And that's the majority. 30 First Nation leaders make no salary. Do you think Harper's ever going to do that? Do you think any Prime Minister's ever going to do that for his people? Or her people? Of course not. These are the kinds of facts we have to put on the table. And let's talk about corruption. Let's talk about robocalls. Let's talk about the F-35s. Let's talk about Bev Oda. Let's talk about Senator Brazeau. Okay, no, never mind. I don't talk about that. When we're talking about corruption, we have to put facts on the table. Where are the real problems here? It's the people who are holding the billions of dollars in our purse strings. It's not our community leaders. There's bad apples everywhere, but they're the minority. A study was done by the Assembly of First Nations of all of the audits in conjunction with Indian Affairs, of all of the audits, to look for corrupt activity. And corrupt means you're purposely taking money to buy a boat, go on a vacation, do something that you're not allowed to spend it on. Less than 5% had any evidence that could possibly be corruption. And that's a lower corruption rate than the federal government, provincial government, and municipal governments in this country. So if anybody needs a Financial Transparency Act, it's the Harper government, not First Nations. But that's not what this is about, because when you actually read it, it's about making First Nations divulge their business information to the public. Because when you divulge all of your business information to the public, it takes away your competitive advantage. And they've had just about enough of us starting to develop economically. They say they want us to develop economically, but then when you start trading tobacco, they confiscate it. If you want to open a casino, they will arrest you. If you want to engage in any other kind of activity, like say fish eels, how many people want to fish eels? They will run over your boats and beat you and pepper spray you. And those are the facts that we have to deal with in this movement. All of this legislation, if you have questions about it, I'm happy to answer it in the question and answer period, but I don't want to bore all the students in here with all the intricate details. Needless to say, this is essentially what it does. If you look at all of the legislation and look at the patterns, what is the legislation doing overall? Well, first of all, it ignores our sovereignty and jurisdiction. Who is anybody else to legislate our communities for us? We'll decide what kind of education we want and how we're going to organize it. Not the Canadian government. Because every time they try to meddle in what's good for us, like education, we end up with things like residential schools. Every time they manage our housing portfolios, we end up with moldy asbestos housing that falls apart. When they mess around with our water, over a third of us don't have clean drinking water. I think it's time that we took care of things ourselves. And here's another reason why. Of the $9 billion that's appropriated by Parliament for First Nations communities every year, over a third of that goes just to pay for the salaries of the INAC bureaucrats. And keep in mind what goes into that. That's all of their vacations, their professional development, their language training, their days off, all of that, sick leave, family leave, education leave, everything that First Nations should be benefiting from out of our treaties, we subsidize the good life of their kids. All of their kids go to good schools. All of their kids get an education. If we took just that $3 or $4 billion a year that they suck up in salary to manage our lives, wow, what a huge difference that would make. Imagine if we had governments that had tons of staff to help and run these programs at the community level. What if we had the money for infrastructure? Each community is affected very differently, mind you. But that's a lot of money to be going to people who are not doing a very good job. This legislation violates First Nation laws, it violates our treaty and Aboriginal rights. For the government to even talk about education and nationalizing education in legislation is a violation of our treaty rights to education. Because they're already set out in the treaties, they're constitutionally protected, they're international protected. They can't touch that, that's a right. They want to change that right unilaterally, and they don't have the power to do so. What's the objective here with all this legislation? Why do I want you to all be concerned without getting into all the legal details of it? It's because the objective is assimilation. What Harper calls it is integration. He wants us to integrate and be the same as all other Canadians. But this is the ultimate objective. And this policy objective has never changed, ever, throughout history. Since the time they started writing Indian policy until now, the objective is to obtain the rest of our lands and resources and reduce financial obligations to us. And how do you do that? Well, you take the rest of our lands and resources and you get rid of any kind of distinct identity. And how do I know this? Well, I had to do research for my doctorate, and I had to research just government documents which talked about what are their policy objectives. And all of their policy objectives are related to those two things: accessing our lands and resources and reducing financial obligations to us. And their primary method of doing that is legislative assimilation. They haven't changed. I wrote a book about it. It's still the exact same. This is an old sign from the United States when they had the Dawes Act, when they were trying to do the same thing in the United States, but it applies equally here. But I Don't Know More isn't just about our rights. For many of our communities, and there's about 130 of the 615 communities in this country, they are in multiple overlapping crises. And when I say that, it means many communities have a housing crisis, a lack of water crisis, a lack of sanitation crisis, a suicide crisis, and a food insecurity crisis all at the same time. And they might also be flooded out of their community every so many years. These crises are nothing new. We only just heard about it because of Attawapiskat, right? Oh, wow, there's a community with a crisis. But there's 130 that have been in that crisis for decades. And what are we doing about it? Why do we have homelessness? I Don't Know More is standing up and saying, okay, we need to talk about all of these big picture items. We need to negotiate how we go forward. But right now, right this very minute, Canada has the power to address the crisis that our people face. And what the grassroots people seem to be saying is that it's time that there was something for us. So if you're going to come to the table and talk treaties, or you're going to come to the table and talk self-government or land claims or whatever, what are you going to do right now to help that woman who doesn't have a house for her 8 kids? Because it can be addressed right now. If we want to go fight a war in Afghanistan, we can appropriate $3 billion from Parliament in a night. If we wanted to address the housing crisis, or the overrepresentation of our kids in care, or the overrepresentation of our peoples in prison, or the lack of water and sanitation, we could do it. So what's the problem? It's a matter of choice. What about all the murdered and missing Indigenous women? That's not new. What are we actually doing about it? Well, Harper dedicated funding to give polices and judges cultural training. That's not dealing with the core underlying issues of how it is we got to be in this position to begin with, when we call the police and they don't look for our women or our young girls, or the traffic in the sex traffic. What about the purposeful chronic underfunding? People say we get everything for free. I used my status card the other day to buy winter boots, and the girl at the counter said, I was talking to Pokey about this. The girl at the counter said, "Oh, not fair, you're so lucky." Like, really? You want to trade places? Do you want to go live in Attawapiskat? Do you want to go live in a northern community that has no running water, no internet, no school because it was contaminated and the federal government decided not to do anything about it? That's lucky. So you just can't have it both ways. You can't just get the perks